All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. First, welcome and thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's event, Survivor Perspectives, Increasing Identification Through Labor Trafficking Outreach. My name is Megan Mahoney, and I'm the Deputy Director of Framework. Framework is a labor trafficking focused training and technical assistance project that's funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. And we work to support starting and seasoned service providers and their partners to identify and serve labor trafficking survivors in their communities through remote activities. Eventually, we'll have in-person activities. We're looking forward to that one day, and also resource development. So before I turn it over to our facilitator and our really amazing panelists, I just want to go through some housekeeping items. First, this is a 1.5 hour event and it's being recorded, and you'll get a link to the recording following the event. All attendees are currently muted right now, and to switch between phone and computer audio, just click on audio settings. We welcome your comments and questions throughout today's event. And want to invite you, if you haven't already, to click the chat bubble now and select all panelists and attendees so that everybody gets your message. And you can share your name, agency, and location so folks have a sense of who's in the room with us. To ask questions, go ahead and click on the Q&A button. And if you see a submitted question that you'd also like answered, feel free to upvote it by clicking the thumbs up next to that question. We're going to save the questions for the end, but feel free to submit them throughout as they occur to you during the conversation. And then we'll ask that at the end, I'll turn on your camera. I'll send you a little prompt that your question's going to be next. And then if you're comfortable, feel free to turn on your camera and ask the question directly, knowing that as speakers, we want to make these folks as comfortable as possible. It's a little tough sometimes speaking out into an abyss where you can't see who's there asking the question. So if you do feel comfortable, I'll encourage you to do that. Otherwise, I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Charlee Borg, who will do the introductions.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's great to connect with you all today. We're really, really excited to be here. And first, I just wanted to go over a couple of learning objectives. By the end of this webinar and presentation, we hope that you'll be able to evaluate outreach materials and strategies at your agency. We hope that you'll understand barriers to survivors in utilizing the outreach that you are creating and putting out there in the world. And we hope that you'll be better at considering information and mechanisms that help survivors reach out to service providers. And the next thing that I want to do is to give you a little bit of introduction to some of the information that we were able to get from the panelists prior to this, this panel. So just to get everybody on the same page, we wanted to share some pretty exciting and potentially surprising information, such as out of the panelists that we have today, none of them saw labor trafficking outreach while being trafficked. And I think that that's something that speaks to the needs of who we're talking to, when we're talking to them, how we're talking to them, and the mechanisms that we're using as far as imagery, as far as language, as far as descriptions, and information sharing. So all topics that we're going to be talking about today, and getting that information straight from the individuals who know it the best. Another thing that we found was that 75% of the panelists that are speaking today stated that outreach could have mitigated the trafficker misinformation tactics that kept them from reaching out and seeking help. If our outreach is to do anything, we need it to be able to decrease barriers so that people can be accessing our resources. Hopefully today we'll be able to speak to some of the ways that outreach can better do that. And out of the panelists, all of them stated that outreach they've seen did not connect with them, that it wasn't something that felt like it represented them, their experience, or their community. So just with that that intro, I wanted to give everyone that background and now pass it over to our amazing panelists and begin our talk today on how we can increase our outreach mechanisms so that we are reaching further and actually connecting with the survivors. So if the panelists can, at this moment, turn on their video. Hello, fantastic panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to hand it over to you to give the audience some information on your background so that they can consider what questions they might have during this process. Remembering to use that Q&A feature throughout the presentation. We will be monitoring the chat, but upvoting, downvoting through the Q&A feature is going to be the best way to ask questions. And just a reminder, when asking questions, please be considerate, please be trauma informed. Please ensure that your questions are questions that you would feel comfortable answering in front of a room of 100 people that you do not know. And with that, I will hand it over to Bella.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start by introducing myself to you. My name is Bella Hounakey. I am originally from Western Africa, Togo. I am currently based in Washington, D.C. That's where I'm tuning in from. And I survived labor trafficking when I was a juvenile. And I was being trafficked in Newark, New Jersey. Yeah. I'll pass it on over to Buki.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Buki Domingos. I'm calling from SoCal, San Diego, LA area. For those of you who are familiar, I am a survivor, lived life expert of labor trafficking. Originally moved from Germany. Roots are Nigerian, so West Africa also. I'm a 42-year-old female, and my trafficking happened in Long Beach, California. I'll pass it on to Evans.
Hello, Evans here. I'm originally from the Bahamas and I was trafficked to Oregon, labor trafficked. That's where I'm calling from right now. And I'm gonna pass it over right now.
Hi, I'm Julissa. I experienced trafficking as a minor and as an adult, migrant trafficking as a minor, and then nonprofit exploitation as an adult. And I'm tuning in from Moline, Illinois, but I usually work from Iowa. Just a little information right now. I'm trying to maintain my voice. I am recovering from COVID-19, so my voice tends to crack. I have plenty of cough drops, so if you can't understand me, please text it and I will try to text it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you all for giving the individuals on this call a little bit more understanding about where you're coming from. We'd like everyone to know that all panelist members did have access to every question that we're asking them today, and were offered support from the staff. So we're going to start it off and ask, do you feel that there were missed opportunities for providers to connect with you during your trafficking experience?
I would say no.
Well, during my trafficking experience, I am convinced that there were lots of missed opportunities because I was a very sick person at one point, and I went in and out of UCLA on a regular basis once a week, and nobody ever asked that question, and I don't remember seeing any pointers in the stalls or anyone indicating or asking if I was trafficked or I needed help. So yeah, lots of missed opportunities on my end.
And can you say a little bit more about what you mean by in the stalls?
So typically in restrooms, in places like hospitals or public areas, there are typically stalls, which just simply means the bathrooms are separated with doors and really just like drywall separations. And typically when you close those doors, nowadays you find more often when you close the door to do your business, you are faced with a poster and it has images, it has a human trafficking hotline. I just missed that a lot during my time when it happened.
I think for me, there was a lot of missed opportunities when it came to human trafficking, worker rights information. We had a lot of sexual assault and domestic violence advocates coming forward and telling us what our rights were then, but nobody could tell us what our rights were as minors, as migrant workers, or even something as simple as letting us know by law where the bathrooms needed to be. As a migrant worker, you have to have a restroom within a quarter mile, and we didn't have that information given to us. So there was a lot of missed opportunities there.
Yeah, also for me, there was nothing around. I'm in Bend, Oregon. I'm located in Bend, Oregon, and that's nothing around or no resources. It's small country, so there's a lot of things that you need, or information, or lawyers, or anyone that you need to talk to that's important, that's going to help you with your case. You usually have to leave and go to Portland. So the information here, it's minimal, because even the officers don't know. Even explaining everything to them, they don't know anything about labor trafficking laws. They don't know anything about it. So they just usually turn their heads and say, hey, you got to figure it out, and that's exactly what we got from an officer. So yeah, missed opportunities.
I wanted to go back to my answer when I responded no. I wanted to say that no, because I was a minor. I was about 9 years old. So I didn't have an opportunity. Even if they were present, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to even engage, interact, or even understand what their presence meant. So that's what I meant by that.
And thinking about how, if there was outreach that you could think of during your experience that would have connected with you, whether or not it's in regards to the descriptions that were provided, the type of outreach that was used, whether or not it's on the radio or the internet, social media, through flyers, through people, what would your gold star outreach have looked like that could have connected with you? And what are some considerations that providers should be holding in their mind?
I would like to speak to that. I have come to find, my 7 years in the US, that the average educational material that is circulating in the US is at 6th grade level. I often found, or have come to find, that most of the resources out there are over-intellectualized. I know for a fact that when somebody's going through trauma, the last thing they want to do is try to read the fine print. So I just, my biggest concern is how over-intellectualized labor trafficking is, and that the best effective way, my opinion and my experience and all the researchers that I have worked with, is breaking it down to address every single population, those who are illiterate, those who are non-English speaking. For example, I live in a border town, those who are migrants, those who are, you name it. The material out there should be easy to read, especially for people that are illiterate, and they should also consider materials for folks who are also visually impaired as well.
I think for me, we would have to go back to understanding that people connect with people. A lot of the times, personally, my family, my grandfather and my grandmother, they couldn't read at all. So the over intellectualization of things is a real thing. But if somebody had come and talked to them when we were getting our safety trainings, when we were suiting up for spraying pesticides, if somebody would have come to talk at that time, that would have been important, which is why now in the field as an advocate, I do those onboardings to make sure that they have a face to come to so that they know, I remember her face, I remember her name, she can help us.
Thank you, Buki and Julissa, for that. I will speak on that as well to further expound. As a minor, I couldn't read, right? I'm not from this country. I couldn't read, nor could I speak English. And I remember I didn't really have access to public and to even engage with people. But one thing I did remember was being in the car with my trafficker a lot. And then I remember him listening or her listening to a radio station all the time, news all the time, and there would be commercial breaks. And I think that would have been a perfect opportunity to kind of conduct outreach where, you know, perhaps it can be in a different language so that we can reach the populations that are not, didn't receive structured education like Buki mentioned.
Thank you, Bella. Any last minute thoughts on kind of your gold star outreach and recommendations?
Well, quickly to touch on, especially for those who are clinicians and healthcare providers, stats have shown for us in San Diego that it takes 3 years for somebody to go in and out with law enforcement, and even much more frequently when they are dealing with clinicians and healthcare providers. So just to break down those stereotypes and try to understand the background and remove the image in the head of what a trafficked victim looks like to be able to better ascertain the situation. So these people that come into those clinics with the STIs or the bruised arm that they fell, they're not just overlooked.
Thank you. Thank you all for the recommendations of making sure that you are targeting your outreach, speaking to each population and speaking to them in the way that makes sense to them, whether or not it is through images or different languages, and through the different mechanisms that you're using, whether or not it's radio, leaving pamphlets or informational materials at clinics, or providing know your rights information when you're in person reaching out to migrant workers. I appreciate everything that you've added. And the next question is, what should providers know about trafficker misinformation and control techniques to help speak to barriers in connection and keep their resources within reach of survivors?
I can address the question if nobody else wants to go first. I don't mind. So the question says, let me repeat to make sure I understand every segment because it's a little bit of peeling. Could you read the question one more time?
Yes, absolutely. So what should providers know about trafficker misinformation tactics to be able to talk about them in their outreach so that survivors can connect with resources?
Well, the first misconception about human trafficking is it's mainly people coming from across the border. That's the very biggest misconception, especially here in my region in SoCal. Majority of people trafficked, 85% of them are US citizens. That's the first misconception. Second huge misconception is putting an age. Thinking we don't need to look into our middle schools or our high schools because we need to focus on the college, the sexually active people. And the truth is, when research was done in 2016 that made everybody really scramble, signs of trafficking was found all over San Diego, and it's a city of over 3 million people, the wealthy as well as the poor neighborhoods, and the youngest average age was 15. So they found traces in middle schools and high schools. Another misconception about trafficking is it only has to do with people with poor socioeconomic status. That is inaccurate information also. And another biggest thing about trafficking is the classical image of somebody locked up in a basement in shackles. Human trafficking has morphed over the years. We find consistently that there is peer-to-peer trafficking, and there is no age limit and there's no specific look. So when these people come into the clinic, it's difficult to not put somebody in a box, but I encourage clinicians and social workers and advocates to just keep an open mind and remove those stereotypical images, because there's no one shoe fits all for how a trafficked victim should look like.
Also, I think that for providers, understanding cultural norms and taboo issues to discuss, for myself, and I'm only speaking for myself here, one of the biggest chains, so to say, was the psychological coercion that I faced. There was I was, like Buki said, I was not tied into a basement. It was the thought of my abuser letting my male family members know of the sexual abuse that had been going on. That was the psychological coercion, was if you tell anybody what's going on, we're going to tell your family what we did to you, and then you're going to bring shame to them. So understanding that a lot of the times, that's a hard pill to swallow, to say, I don't want to disappoint my family, but yet I know that this is wrong. So just by somebody coming forward, knowing that that is the hardest step that they've probably ever taken in their life.
I also wanted to, in the question of trafficker misinformation, I also think that often we as public or those engaged in anti-trafficking efforts, they just like they misidentify sometimes or overly identify victims to be from a specific region or country. That happens to traffickers also. Oftentimes it's believed that traffickers are only men, or like gangs, and it could be institutions, it can be organizations, it can be women. There's actually a high percentage of women being traffickers. So a profile of trafficker doesn't only encompass this male drug lord. It can be somebody, it can be religion institutes. So it's important that we keep that in mind, because, you know, lack thereof, we could be, our outreach won't be as effective. Another one I wanted to speak on too is the overly a lot of people qualify trafficking as a violent crime, and Julissa, you spoke on this. It doesn't need to involve a violence, right? It could be the psychological aspect of it. They could use your cultural belief as means to manipulate you. There are so many factors that involve trafficking except for the physical violence aspect.
I'm hearing so many important themes coming up. Thank you guys for highlighting a lot of the myths and misconceptions that are out there that are sometimes unintentionally reinforced in some of the outreach materials that we see. And I think, Julissa, your points about confidentiality is such an important one, that even, you know, including on a poster or on an outreach card that that your information will not be shared, that you can come and talk to us and no one will know that you made that phone call. No one will know that you came into the office. I think that's really important. Might be an assumption that we make is obvious, but if you're in that situation, you're really concerned about other people knowing about what you've experienced, that's going to be a really important factor in your determination about whether to call that number.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives on that question. I think that we all got a lot of great information on how we can speak more directly to some of this misinformation through our outreach mechanisms to attempt to tear down those barriers so that individuals experiencing trafficking know that they can connect, and that that there are at the very least laws and things to protect individuals experiencing trafficking, though there are going to be things that providers cannot necessarily protect individuals experiencing trafficking from, like the trafficker sharing scary and shameful and traumatic information with our communities, with our family members. But just holding that reality hopefully allows providers to better consider all the steps that are needed in making that connection. So speaking of that, how do you all feel that providers could do a better job of connecting to survivors and their specific communities?
So there's two answers I wanted to give this. I think in terms of connecting survivors to, can you repeat the question?
Always. How can providers do a better job of connecting to survivors and their communities? And thinking about the fact that a lot of you stated that you didn't feel like there was representation of your experience or people that looked like you or that were in your situations.
There's something so I think there's an intersectionality between when a survivor experienced labor trafficking and sex trafficking together. Sometimes providers tend to allocate resources to just one. And then by doing that, they unconsciously just neglect the other aspects of the survivor's experience. So I think collaboration and to giving the survivor a voice to, what are your needs are, going back to the basics, what are your needs are, and not just have this assumption that, providers know exactly what a survivor need is based on the story, based on the background, really engaging the survivor in their treatment plan or whatever that may be, so that they can have a say in the type of resources they receive, or even in the communities in which they're placed in, because oftentimes, most times than not, there is still a shame associated with people of my culture knowing what happened to me. So survivor might not even want to be connected to individuals in their community, or they might not even they might want to assume over this whole new identity. So including them in their treatment process. I would say that I was not included in where I go, what I receive, and I just went along. And so a lot of stress on both survivor and service providers' part. They could have saved a lot of stress on all of us if I were to be included in my service plan, like holistically.
For me,
I'm
sorry. I always start off with for me. I apologize. Overcoming implicit biases that you may have that you don't even realize you have. Having a basic understanding of intergenerational trauma and what could be considered intergenerational trafficking. I come from, we counted back about 8 generations of migrant workers. And along the line, there's not a single person in my family that I don't think that has experienced some type of labor exploitation. The other thing is understanding that when we focus, and I'm gonna piggyback a little off what Bella said, on just one, or we sensationalize sex trafficking, we're creating a hierarchy of trauma within survivors that puts us in competition when we should be working together to build each other up. And by dismissing one person's trauma over another's, it really makes us as survivors of what people consider the lesser form of trafficking feel invalidated. We don't have that same backing. I can give you an example of, I was trafficked as a minor in a migrant camp. yet there is no law that protects me. I still have to prove that I was trafficked. While we have sex trafficking survivors, the law defines it. They are survivors no matter what. If we could get federal backing, and if we could get people within the movement themselves, our service providers, to understand that we need to be equal. We need to see trafficking as just human trafficking versus labor and sex trafficking, so that we can truly understand and begin to be proactive instead of always being responsive to when it comes to trafficking.
If we still have some time, I do want to speak to the question.
Absolutely.
From a clinician's point of view, because I am one myself, one of the things that are often missed is when solutions or plans or strategies are being made, it's often found that the most impacted communities are not at the table. And even if they are at the table, the information is collected and still certain decisions are made without the most marginalized communities. For my region, I can speak to the Black community versus the Latino community. We have a minority Black community in San Diego, especially. We have an overwhelming increase of the Latino population, which sometimes marginalizes the Black communities even more. And they're both going through the same thing, where we have more resources for a certain population of color and less resources for a certain population of color. So the word actually is victim-centered approach. How do we best, and when I say victim-centered approach, I just don't mean because a study has been done on 200 people, now we have all the tools to address the issues of labor trafficking. What I mean is each person that walks through that door is a brand new case. Each person that comes through that clinic door, that social work door, that advocacy door, you should not have to look up a book to be able to help that person, because they are bringing their own trauma and their own story, and it needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So that's something that cannot be assumed. Another thing, I'm part of the Survivor Leader Network of San Diego, and that is predominantly a board that is made up of survivors of human trafficking. There were bills that were proposed to be able to, at the state level. And to my, I don't even know the words to describe it, but it was horrific to see that 99.9% of the bills did not even make it to the floor. They were all killed. And this is an issue. And then this is even dealing with sex trafficking. And like Julissa said, the less part of trafficking is considered labor trafficking, even if it's unspoken. And that's why when I saw this opportunity, I was really, really intrigued and happy to be here, because it's really important not to re-traumatize by invalidating somebody else's trauma. And that was why my cases were one of the most complicated they had seen in years. Because here I was claiming labor trafficking and my trafficker was my husband. It was very, very complicated. And I was actually asked several times, are you sure it wasn't sex trafficking? Are you sure? Because if you said sex trafficking, we could do X, Y, Z. And that is an issue and that needs to be rectified. So the biggest starting point for me is having authentic survivors at the table from marginalized communities, because we are the ones hurting the most and only we can speak to our trauma and our pain. And I feel that's the best way to come up with concrete solutions that could address specific issues.
Can I just follow up, Buki, because I think that's such an important point, and it's something that I think in the field, we know that it's important to have survivors as leaders, to partner with them side by side in addressing these issues and figuring out how to approach all of the aspects of combating labor trafficking and sex trafficking for that matter. I think where we run into problems is when we think about like the how, right? Because we want to be really cautious, we want to be respectful, we want to be protective, we want to follow the rules and make sure we're not re-traumatizing or causing harm in engaging with survivors to do the work. And so this isn't the topic of this discussion, but I want to make sure we take just a second. Maybe if you could speak to what some of the practices would be that you recommend in terms of partnering with survivors specifically on outreach. Who should they be connecting with? What kind of groups or allies could they be engaging with? And then in terms of what kind of role they play. So many organizations, they don't have funding to bring on survivors as consultants. And so they might have some questions about how exactly to engage survivors respectfully if they're not able to pay them. Should they engage them? So sorry, that was just a mind dump. I just didn't want to let that moment pass because I think it's too important.
So the first thing that's really critical is when you're dealing with a live life expert or survivor, however the person chooses to describe themselves. One thing you want to avoid is re-exploitation of that person. So human trafficking is pretty much modern day slavery. Somebody has been asked to do something for a long period of time without any compensation. That person is living in inhumane conditions and has no means of livelihood and has pretty much their dignity stripped away from them. The last thing any provider, any nonprofit wants to do, and I can freely use my story within 1 minute to drive my message home, is re-exploit that person. If there is no budget, then go out, find some grants, write the grants. When you get the budget, get the survivor on board. Because the truth is, anybody who has been through the survivor issue has extreme financial hardship. So it's okay to compensate that person when they are trying to use their story to bring about education and enlightenment, which is also a great tool. Now, another thing is the role the nonprofit organizations play. I was re-exploited by a nonprofit in San Diego for almost 2 years. I was in there, I was asked to volunteer my time, and before I knew it, I was at 50 hours a week. I had a workers' comp accident where I was physically disabled by breaking 3 bones in my foot and cracking my knee, the round bone, which is called a patella. I was denied medical treatment because I was not considered a staff member. I had to sue the nonprofit and for 2 years was in extreme pain and was taken off the floor and couldn't work to be able to get medical treatment and a surgery that finally happened last year. This is a classical example of re-exploitation. Folks should be mindful that when survivors are called to these spaces, they should be paid. They should be compensated. When they apply for a job as an advocate or whatever, they literally should be put at the top of the list because they're not just applying for the job as somebody who studied it in college and doesn't have any experience, but they're bringing their experience to the table, which is critical if folks are really sincere about making substantial change. For me, those are the really, really big issues. And every day we run into re-exploitation, and every day survivors are re-traumatized just because I don't know if people do not understand, if they don't care, if they're worried about the reputation of their company. Like for me, I had to be sworn to secrecy that I will not say it in public that they were sued. They had me sign a paper. So stuff like that. We have to be mindful of how we re-exploit and how we just take advantage of somebody who's already in a very vulnerable position.
Thank you, Buki, for all of that information that I think is never something that we can hear enough, how much we need to avoid re-exploitation, re-traumatization, and really empower individuals and see them as what they are, as experts in the topic that deserve to be worked with and paid as consultants. I think that throughout this, we gained a lot of great information and considerations on how to connect with clients, whether or not it's through representation or mitigating some of the normalcy that survivors might experience and have perspectives of due to intergenerational trafficking, due to growing up in that situation, and the need for that type of information, the importance of representation and ensuring that we are connecting and representing individuals from different walks of life in our outreach, such as domestic trafficking and trafficking of foreign nationals, for labor trafficking of not just individuals from Spanish-speaking communities and not just adults. Is there anything that panelists would like to add on ideas of how to increase outreach and connect with different communities before we move to the next question?
I want to speak on advertisers, people that advertise trafficking. And I just want to speak on them because my situation is so much different from a lot of people's situations, where I actually bought my own ticket. I was promised a job. I was promised the documents that I needed upon arrival, and I was promised a certain pay. I bought my own ticket. It wasn't no trauma, no craziness going on. Everything went fine, and just making it here and starting to work for the guy. After a week, a lot of questions just came to me to ask him, to ask the guy that trafficked me here. I didn't know I was being trafficked at the time, but I basically wanted to know, I'm driving a company truck that you haven't even gave me a document to say, well, hey, you can drive this illegally. And I know that I'm not doing it legally. That's why I'm asking these questions, but you're telling me that I'm okay, we're fine, we're working out these paperworks. And it wasn't like I was, the only thing I can say that was bad is, him giving me a pay stub every 2 weeks that says $1,500 and I'm getting $200 back, to live off of for 2 weeks. And he said, hey, this is the money that we're using every, to get the documents and all of the paperwork. Things were going good. If someone gave you no reason, they always smile. They give you no reason to not believe them, And I was 25-year-old black man from the Bahamas, speaks English. How are you being trafficked? Anyone I told that, hey, this is what's going on, they don't understand that. There's no way a 25-year-old black man is being trafficked that speaks English, and understands laws and rules and things. So I just want to speak on it from the standpoint of, if you're going to advertise and it's just a bunch of little white girls on it, that's not trafficking. And you have a law that states my situation is actually trafficking also, So if you're going to advertise, put everything in one, So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Evans. There were so many good specifics there on how we can increase our representation through imagery, how we can add specific examples about what people might be experiencing to the outreach materials, whether or not that's through kind of these advertising campaigns and public service announcements, things on the radio, things on the TV, things on YouTube channels. So thank you so much for all of that insight. Anything else before we switch to the next question?
Charlie, this might be the question for the next, but anyways, I wanted to say that we are here to talk about outreach, right? But I encourage everybody with us today to keep in mind outside. So let's remove the curtain of outreach, and you conduct outreach. You have a number of survivors at your door. What's next, right? I think outreach also needs to encompass preparation for, if you do have survivors, you have the capacity to provide somewhat of like not long-term forever care, but equip them for as long as you can so that they can feel empowered to go out. All of us here today, I see all of us as we're now like very productive members of society. We're able to communicate with you and give you recommendations on how you can improve your services. But then this is not a representation of all survivors or all lived life experts. Some of them are seeking help, but they don't have the support that they need in communities and their respective settings to keep going. So I encourage each of you to look at your organizations, look at your framework, look at your dialogue, continue having this dialogue of, as of today, do we have what it needs to provide to survivors if they do show up? Do we have the capacity to continue to empower them? Are we continuing supporting are we having increased effort to make sure that we are not re-exploiting survivors? So as much as I love this outreach conversation, I also want to keep encouraging you to have the conversation beyond outreach, because if we stop here, our efforts will only go thus far as we work on it.
Thank you so much, Bella. An incredibly important part that before you bring individuals to your organization, make sure that you have the resources available so that you're not opening a door and inadvertently shutting it in someone's face in a time of incredible need, and perhaps one of the only times that they're going to choose to reach out. And I think that within that section, we got a lot of information about not only the need to be prepared with our organization, but with our partners, with the police, like Evans was talking about, with the medical community, like Buki was discussing, and the need to create educational materials and potentially outreach for your partners. There's also this other concept of ensuring that you are being the best for the individuals who are coming to your door. With labor trafficking in the human trafficking community, a lot of organizations, I think, pause at that moment, at that consideration. And if you are stuck there, I challenge you and your partner organizations, your task forces, your partners across the community to move further. Because if you're looking around and saying, I'm not the best person, we're not the best organization suited for this population, look around and see if anybody else is feeling the same way. If you're all in that position, what is available for survivors and for people experiencing trafficking in your community? On the note of kind of this realization of reaching out, a few of the panelists noted that even when they were engaged in services at the beginning, they potentially didn't yet identify as experiencing labor trafficking, that the process of realization took a while, potentially because of some of those stereotypes and biases that they already had in their mind, and potentially because of the incredible amount of work that is required of them in connecting with services and beginning. For one individual, they stated that their experience didn't start when they reached out to the service, that it didn't end when they reached out to the service provider, that it started. So what was it like for you when you did realize you were experiencing labor trafficking, and what can service providers do to make sure that self-identification or lack thereof isn't a barrier to getting support?
I think support, like with the situation that we're in, if you're being trafficked, if you have a provider or you have someone that's helping you, the support shouldn't be halfway. Meaning, because if someone trafficked you, you know, they have all hands on you. Like, there's a lot of things that you can't do, a lot of things that you can't say, a lot of places you can't really go, you know. And I think providers should know, hey, if we're really going to help this person, we need to think about, hey, the next step that is automatically going to be getting them out of that situation, you know. And there's a lot of times you're being helped, and you're being helped while you're still in a situation of distress, and it makes it worse. You know, you're still in that situation. So for trafficking, I think trafficking is a different breed of, you know, crime. So when someone is helping you, they need to help you right away. You need to get out of it right away, not stay in that situation while you're being helped and not knowing what's going to happen. Because, you know, while we're being helped and we still don't know for sure, hey, are we really going to get the help? You know, I'm talking to someone and they're giving me these promises here, and promises there, but are we really going to get that help? That if, you know, even if it's just a month, you know, that month is terrifying because you don't know what's going to happen, because you have this side you're trying to get away from, this side trying to help you, but you're not sure what's going to happen in that time. So I think it always needs to be, hey, if we're going to help this person, next step, get them out right away, as soon as we can, you know?
Thanks, Evans. I would say that I was trafficked when I was 9 years old. I didn't know what traffic even is. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't even know there was such thing as the term trafficking. And even during the process of being trafficked, so this would have been from 9 until I was 14, turning 15. Something was always wrong, but you don't know what it is. And because of cultural beliefs, because, you know, like abuse, the way exploitation work is that, so, you know, traffickers are great manipulators, and they tell you all type of things to justify what they're doing to you. So for me, it was not until, you know, law enforcement came, and then they were arresting all of us. And then we knew that something was fundamentally wrong. And we were transported to like a jail cell, and we're like, okay, this doesn't make sense. And so along the process of trying to unpack what's been happening over the years, then I started learning, okay, so this is what human trafficking is. This is why it's wrong in America. This is why it's not justified as they told me to. And so, you know, I think with the language barrier, not understanding the essence of what was going on, and being a minor, everything was just so difficult to unpack. So it's kind of challenging because I didn't know during the process I was being trafficked. It took me a while that I think it took me up until I had to participate in the criminal investigation, where I started learning about, okay, this is what this is. And so that I can alleviate myself or be a part of the criminal investigation. So, yeah, that's what I had to say about that. And I forgot the question, but that's what I have to say about that.
So I would like to just chime in from my perspective and my experience and everyone I've worked with. I know that human trafficking happens in different ways, but I personally have been able to identify 3 main stages of human trafficking. And I didn't get this from anyone. This is just my experience. So there is the actual stage of when somebody is being trafficked, which is the active stage of being trafficked. And then you have the escape or the freedom stage, pretty much when this person has found refuge in some organization that has been able to remove them from that situation. And this is where a lot of resources and monies are being focused on. And for folks, they feel, unlike every other panelist has said, they feel that when they get to the escape or freedom stage, amazing, our job is done. We were able to free 100 people this year. They're all patting themselves on the back, a meeting in DC. But for a survivor, there is a 3rd stage, which is the longest and most difficult. And this is where survivors commit suicide. This is where they go back to their trafficker. It is the period of great uncertainty and no control. It is the period of a new self-identification. And I call that stage the life after stage. And that's the most longest and difficult. So with the life after stage, you find people that have credentials from outside of the US having to go through the regular system like everybody else. And it doesn't matter if they're a survivor or not. Those people in those offices don't want to hear it. There are no structures or resources specifically to help survivors of human trafficking. Just slide right back with some credential verification into their old job to remove them from financial hardship. There are no resources for housing. Goodness, I'm in Southern California. Housing is an issue and it's expensive and it's overpopulated. And the low-income housing lists, goodness, Section 8. I have been on Section 8 for 7.5 years. I don't need Section 8 anymore because I just bought a home this year. But imagine somebody who is still going through it and is desperately waiting for that housing voucher to get themselves and their families out of their cars. Now, this is where I feel the providers fall short, and they always have the story of, well, we don't have the budget. And then they have all these other things where they're throwing billions of dollars around and not dedicating anything to human trafficking, not to even talk of labor trafficking that is, in my opinion, considered the less of both traffickings. So the big challenge for everybody here today to take back to your organizations is, how can we flip this around? Because when you're actively being trafficked and you've just been released, I believe there's federal funding for no more, I believe 2 times 3 months, so 6 months. If you're lucky, they might give you for 9 months, and it's a few $100s. The challenge is to really put monies into the life after. And it should be, like I say, a victim/survivor/live life expert centered approach. Some people might take 2 years. Some people might take 10. Some people might end up committing suicide just because they feel they have lost everything and there's no way they can ever get it back. Some might be so traumatized that you're just hooked on addiction till they finally overdose and die. This is a challenge for everybody here on this call today. It's nice to talk about outreach, but there's something that you should put in your minds, which is the hugest problem, the life after. That is an issue. I'll use myself quickly as an example, and then I'll hop off and let other folks like Evans and Julissa chime in. I was practicing as a nurse in Europe for over a decade. I come here, I get trafficked, I escape, I try to challenge the boards of registered nursing, and I get told that my credentials are worthless. Through the times, my credentials expired. I had to call my family to find my high school diploma to go all the way back to school. That for me is an atrocity. It shouldn't happen. So providers need to find funding to assist survivors with a life after, because that's where the biggest hurdle is. And that's where many people just never make it out.
Absolutely.
We're hearing the frustration in your voice, Buki, and thank you for speaking from your experience. You know, I think it's something that it's worth repeating and emphasizing to folks that when we meet survivors as service providers, it's a critical tipping point. There's this sense of like, oh, the trauma is over, the trafficking is over, now you're safe, now life is going to be better. But the factors that make people vulnerable to trafficking to begin with are still present at the point that we meet them as service providers. And so it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we're meeting our needs. And as far as we've come, and since the TVPA was passed, as much as we've done to increase outreach and increase engagement in services, what we hear you saying is that it's not enough. We still have a long way to go. And I appreciate you bringing that call to action on the call today. Thank you.
I would like to say that I agree that we need to put more into life after. But one thing I really want us to be conscious of is rescue mentality. We need to stray from that. Nobody needs to rescue us unless there are smaller children. We need to learn self-autonomy. That is one of the things that our abusers took from us. They took the ability of financial stability. And we also need to understand that, like for me, in my examples in my life, was I needed to send money back home. I'm American. I was born in Silvis, Illinois. I was trafficked in Texas all the way up. My family still needed the money. We need to understand that there is trauma bonds that keep survivors with their abusers. We also, because it could be either familial, it could be peer-to-peer, where they don't even know. I did not realize, I'm 37 now, until I was 35 years old, that I had been exploited. And it wasn't until I was at the Freedom Network conference where I was sitting having a beer with one of my friends that he sat down with me and he said, I need to talk to you about what I believe could have happened to you. And I didn't even know, because those stereotypes that we see of the little And don't get me wrong, I'm pretty light complected, but the little Caucasian girls with dark hands covering their mouth, chained, duct tape over their mouth, I did not fit that idea. So I didn't even identify. So we need to understand that people we might come in contact with might not even identify as a survivor, as a lived life expert, as whatever you want to call them. I personally don't like the term survivor because it doesn't fit with me, with my lifestyle. But really understanding that that rescue mentality puts people in harm as well. We never know what's going on behind closed doors. We never know the reason behind some of the choices they have made. We don't understand. I know that there have been plenty of times where organizations that I've worked with have said, we're going to swoop in and we're going to take these girls from being sex trafficked. And they don't realize that these are people who are of age of consent, and they are just sex workers. They're not being trafficked, but it's their biases because of their rescue mentality that they believe that they are being harmed. So we need to really just push all of our biases. We can't work in social work, and we can't work with other members of different communities if we don't understand that their life may not reflect ours.
Thank you so much, Julissa. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for all of the insight that you have shared on your experience and on mechanisms that providers can use to ensure that they are reaching out and really connecting with individuals that it might not ever be a part of their journey to self-identify. So how challenging might it be when we even say explicitly, are you a human trafficking victim on a billboard or on a pamphlet? How hard might it be for someone who is not seeing themselves in images, or who we're asking to have some sort of threshold of experience when we, with our outreach and with our programming resources, are saying in a way that sex trafficking is more important than labor trafficking because that's our focus so frequently, or that one population is more important than another because that is our focus so frequently. So the need for individuals to feel empowered, represented, and potentially to not be required to self-identify as experiencing human trafficking before they make a phone call to a provider, or before they're able to receive housing assistance or food assistance. So just some things for individuals on the calls to think about. Thank you to all of the panelists for everything that you've provided so far. This is the moment when we're going to move to the Q&A option. With individuals on the call, remember that at the bottom of your screen, you have a few different icons. The icon that looks like two speaking bubbles together, that's the Q&A image. And if you click on that, it takes you to an area where some questions have actually already been asked. And here you can upvote and downvote questions. You can upvote questions that you really want to hear the answers to. We're trying to get to everything today. And if you have additional questions, please ask them in the Q&A feature. It's going to be the easiest way for us to see you. And for individuals that did show their gratitude or share some of the ways that the panelists have really related and spoken to their own personal experiences, thank you so much for putting that here. It is something that we did have to remove, and all of that information will be getting to the panelists, all of your gratitude, all of the ways that they have impacted you. It's just a little bit of clearing so that we can make sure that we're focusing on the questions for the panelists. Thank you so much. And Megan, where are we starting with the questions?
I'm going to start. Rachel Parker submitted a question early on. I know she had to jump off, so I'm going to toss this out. It's specifically for Buki about sharing more about how within the healthcare and hospital systems, folks can be more proactive about recognizing labor trafficking red flags. But I'll start with Buki and open that up to anyone who has insight into that question.
Thanks for asking the question. It is tricky because often there is that box again, human trafficking, and folks just relate to sex trafficking more than they relate to labor trafficking. And forget that labor trafficking started right in Egypt with those slaves trying to run to Israel, and started in 1619 in the US with the first slaves hitting the shore of the US. So it's been there forever and a day. And so folks need to understand that they need to get rid of the biases, especially healthcare providers. When you see that migrant from Haiti, from Mexico, wherever they come from, and they keep coming into your clinic for God knows what. It could be minor stuff, but you find this person often in your clinic for whatever. They fell, they bumped their head, they're dehydrated, simple stuff that could easily be missed. It might be a time to start asking them specific questions and find a way to get whoever brought them to the clinic out of the room to ask them some serious questions. And do keep in mind that these folks are trained to say everything is fine. So it might take a little bit more of empathy, not just sympathy, empathy to be able to understand. And the questions shouldn't be over intellectualized. Sometimes just pausing, gauging your near and distance, and putting a hand possibly on the person's shoulder and looking them in the eye and asking, you've been coming here a lot, are you okay? That might help break some of the barriers, and letting the person know, you're protected by HIPAA. If you're afraid that person is going to know, I can never disclose what you tell me because I just cannot because of HIPAA. So those are the ways that healthcare providers can try to reach their people that come into the clinic, especially those that make unnecessary visits. I wouldn't say unnecessary, but they're frequent visits for just really bagatelle things.
Thanks, Buki. I would like to say that, again, my experience being a minor, I've actually, in the 4 years that I was being trafficked, I never received health care. I never saw a doctor. I never went to a hospital. It was a really secure location. We never really interacted with public much. I think aftercare though was significant because I remember very vividly my first experience was a doctor who was giving me some kind of physical, and it was a male. He was a white man, and this is I think I was 14, and they were assessing me, the post-trafficking experience, they would assess you and things like that. And I remember being so utterly uncomfortable because all prior to that, my experience happened to be both labor and sexual abuse. I was utterly so uncomfortable. I think that hour was probably the worst day of my life. I think my body was in shock. So I think just, again, being victim-centered and sensitive, I think things have improved since then. But just thinking about the victim's background and seeing, okay, does this make sense? Does this make sense? Even if the doctor is experienced, does this make sense?
So again, speaking to the need to educate and inform our partners across the board. Thank you so much for that insight, Bella and Buki. Julissa, next we have a question for you, but after Julissa answers, anyone can feel free to chime in.
As a personal victim of COVID, I don't know if you guys can see, but I'm starting to lose my voice.
So Julissa, I think you're so clever because you can see everything, can't you? And we're gonna let people chime in through the video, and yeah, but I'm sure that you've already got this answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So it's been difficult. I'm in Iowa, so I know how very hard it is to do migrant outreach right now with COVID. what we have been doing is with distribution, we've been making little care packages of miniature hand sanitizers, the little, I don't want to say they're the baby wipes, but they're the little packages of hand sanitizing wipes with the hotline number and maybe 3 facts of, or like questions of, excuse me, did you know that you're only supposed to work so many hours a day? Just all over the place. A lot of the times people think that outreach just has to go to migrant workers, and it doesn't. So you can take these to warehouses where then it will get distributed. If like we have pretty big detasseling places here, we take them to their headquarters and they want them to use hand sanitizers because they don't want the spread of COVID. So drop it off to them. I'm trying to think of the other thing we did without losing my voice anymore. Face-to-face interaction. We've been doing safety onboardings where we have about 50 each, and we mask up. We have our face shields, and we speak into a mic. It's still one of those things that you really can't replace that face-to-face interaction, but you just have to take your own personal precautions. As you can see, COVID is absolutely everywhere, and you can get it from just about anything, and just be careful with it.
Julissa, thank you so much for providing some insight in how organizations that are providing outreach to agricultural and migrant workers and have really focused on face-to-face outreach can change or adapt some of their outreach mechanisms. Marina, did you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, I guess first just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of you. I think this has been like beyond immensely helpful for all of us on the call. And I was just wondering as a follow-up, so thank you, Julissa, for answering my question. And I was wondering with the outreach that that you do specifically in terms of onboardings, can you speak a little bit to how you have, I guess, created those relationships in order to be able to be allowed access to those spaces where sometimes there's, I guess, because we provide, for example, legal services, a divide in terms of not wanting to allow access to the people who are working in agriculture and construction and whatever.
So I'm lucky into where Iowa Workforce Development has created this migrant outreach group. And what we did was we brought stakeholders to the table, and we said, and I came in as a consultant and now I'm part of the group, is what did I need? And I created a little matrix, and what it is, I divided it up into 4 sections of people who needed to be there, in my opinion. Now this can be worked around with wherever you are, but we talked about legal. So we had Iowa Legal Aid there, and we presented it to our growers, seeders, and feeders as not that they're coming to make claims against them, but as a migrant worker, we face eviction issues, we face domestic disputes, tax concerns, unemployment issues, even when it comes to claiming unemployment. So we presented it as, let's do 1 day of our safety onboardings where you can get all these resources for your workers so that they're not leaving in the middle of the day to go and find it. We also brought in social workers, and a lot of the times you need to go to your state coalitions and see, do they even have human trafficking advocates? Or is it just SA? Is it just DV? Is it just survivors of homicide, of other violent crimes? Do they have information, or at least a basic training on human trafficking information, so that if, I don't want to say confronted, but if somebody were to come forward and disclose, they would at least have the basic minimum understanding of who they needed to make referrals to. We had law enforcement. Is law enforcement even trained, or do they even have the basic understanding of trafficking? Do they know that they can certify for certain things for a U visa? Do they understand what a T visa is, what a U visa is? Do you have someone in your federal investigative agencies that can sign a continued presence if someone were to come forward? All of that type of information, are you aware? Or is somebody in the law enforcement agencies aware of all of the things that they can bring forward to the table and help a survivor versus becoming a barrier of disclosure? Then we have education. Department of Education has a migrant education program that is through all 50 states, I believe, and they help with high school credit recovery. I was trafficked from the time that I was we're going back about 12, 13, all the way up until I was 17. So when I was going from state to state working, I was losing credits in my home state. So they help with that. And here in Iowa, you can be 14 years old and go start detasseling. And a lot of the times families bring their kids to bring that extra income or to have as an in-home babysitter. You should be talking to, depending on where your state is and who their major importer of migrant workers is. Because for migrant work, it's usually US citizens or legal permanent residents. Do you have, like we do here, a good relationship with the Texas Migrant Council, who usually brings forward all of our migrant groups? Or do you have, the North Carolina Growers Association? Do you have those relationships? I can share the little matrix with you, and feel free to add or take away. It's really just something that I came up with to show what were the things that I needed when I was in my situation. And it was help with domestic disputes. It was help with high school credit recovery. It was helping people out because I speak English. I was born here in the US, but there were some people who didn't speak English. So when they were disclosing to me their forms of trafficking, helping them disclose to law enforcement. So if anybody's interested, I can share it. It's literally just something that I made on Word. It's nothing. It's not a fancy infographic or anything like that, but I do have that information for you if needed.
We do have a request for that, Julissa. So if you
Okay.
send that to us, we'll send it out along with the recording. Yeah. So we do have another question here about, I think this is a big one, guys, thinking specifically about what venues you would recommend for folks to connect with survivors. This is a big question. So think back to what were some of the environments that you were in where you had contact with people on a one-time basis, on a regular basis? Who were those people? Where were they? Their potential partners for service providers to engage with. So what were some of those opportunities? What specific venues might you recommend?
Is that still me or is this someone else?
Everyone.
Oh,
it's a free for all.
Just before I forget, because I'm gonna have to get some water here in a minute. Have we all seen like the Western Unions and the MoneyGrams and like well, here it's in Spanish, it's Orden Express? That's a great place. People were always going to cash their checks somewhere, whether it's a partial check, whether it's day labor checks, whatever it is, you go to cash your checks somewhere. It's a great place to just kind of have information, have your one-pagers there or your brochures, because you're more than likely going to keep looking at it. I know that I'm a fidgeter. So when I'm waiting for somebody to cash my check, I'll grab the first thing and just kind of start reading through it. So that's a good place, at least in my experience, to have information or to at least begin contact with. You could have little cards that just say, if you need help, please call.
Thoughts from other panelists on places that you could have seen outreach or individuals that you had any sort of contact with, even if it was just one time?
So with COVID-19, everything has become a challenge. Before you could just say schools, malls, churches, but we find out that many of these places are closed in some parts of the country. Some are open, But I want to speak to the places that are closed. For places like California, where we are still observing some places that are being closed, like schools, for example, are predominantly online, and how do we reach those kids? I would like to draw back to what Bella had said. I do work in another capacity in criminal justice reform. And one thing that has been very instrumental is just really short mini social media campaigns. We live in a world where everybody is online, and even people of a certain age have to get online because that's the only way the majority of the country is communicating right now. And the idea would be to do short videos, can be 20 seconds, 30 seconds, sometimes a minute. And the human brain has to see something for at least 7 times for them to even retain what that was, for them to remember. So for example, like when people are watching YouTube videos, if they don't have the pro version, those publicities should be able to pop up. It should pop up on the radio. It should pop up more often on the TV. Everything that folks must look at just because they're forced to be social distance at this time. And then, because I think that's the biggest challenge, because how can you do outreach when there's nobody there? So I think we should really, really use social media and invest. And starting a video or doing a video doesn't have to be a huge expensive production. It can be something that's really, really affordable.
Potentially also something that Framework can support you in.
I also wanted to add, I mentioned that my experience happened when I was young. I interacted a lot with waste management, right? Those people who pick up trash. So just encouraging, again, it comes from Empower. I would never guess to talk to those people because I didn't speak English at the time, but a way for them to, if you see a house that you're picking up trash at all the time, and you're just noticing something weird, perhaps like be creative, be innovative, think outside of the box, when you're conducting outreach. Another thing I wanted to talk briefly about outside of what we're talking about is the other day I ordered Uber, and this gentleman who looked tired, I kind of just stopped to have a conversation with him. And from what he was sharing, it looks like the account that I ordered from it just didn't meet the person delivering the food. So I stopped and just having a conversation, and I noticed something was awfully wrong. I mean, awfully wrong. He had mentioned that he's been driving for like 20 hours. And also it didn't look like he really spoke English. So something clicked in my brain, and I said, oh my God, this could be a labor trafficking victim. So I went and I was chatting with some of my friends who drive Uber, and they were just explaining to me the ins and outs where, somebody completely, there's a thing going on, a trend in certain communities where some people, traffickers are creative, where they are signing up for Uber, but they will have somebody else drive for significant. So that didn't occur to me until literally like last week. And I was like, oh my God, this could be a labor trafficking victim. So anyway, I reported that to Uber. So, in the individual capacity, things like that, just not just like conducting outreach, but also prioritizing prevention before protection, right? We shouldn't just have reactive ways of doing things. We should like prevent people from being exploited. So that's just something that just clicked, that I've been trying to like create awareness on. So that is my awareness piece for you all. If you notice, again, like going back to misses, if you notice that like something about that scenario just doesn't make sense, don't just stop there.
Thank you so much, Bella. And I think interesting idea there too, that when we're creating outreach, we do it for community members all the time. There are a ton of billboards and posters at the airport, like see something, say something sort of campaigns, where we are sometimes only promoting the sensationalized images of trafficking. And if we did help community members acknowledge some of the signs and some of the things that our panelists have spoken to today, that could be incredibly helpful. And what if we didn't just try to access the community members? What if we provided them with informational material so that if they saw someone, a delivery person at their house, that they could hand them that card that shared rights and that shared information and was a possible way for that person to connect with resources. And I'm gonna hand it over to Megan. I think we have time for one more.
And this is probably a great one to end on. If you can all, in 1 minute or less, answer this question about like the big takeaway for folks. How can we better identify potential victims of labor trafficking?
I can start. Mine is really easy, actually really quick. The big takeaway today should be that a labor trafficking victim doesn't have a specific look. And it'll be nice to just get rid of those biases and stereotypes of what a trafficked victim should look like. And also, it's really important to know that each survivor is unique. So it's not a one-shoe-fit-all, and it's a continuous learning process.
I would say that not just, so identifying your victim, I'm just going to say, encourage all of you, wherever you get your funding from, diversify your funding source, federal government, community resources, grants, so that you are able to put more efforts into resources to provide, identify for victims. So.
All right, thank you so much. And we do have probably 1 more minute if there are any last comments on this question.
Evans or Julissa, I want to give you one last opportunity. I know you had a lot to say on our prep.
I did, but my voice is just about done, so I'm not going to push it.
You rest that voice, Julissa. All right. Well, I just want to, first of all, thank all of our panelists. I have a lot of notes and takeaways from, doing our best not to unintentionally perpetuate myths and misconceptions about labor trafficking, engaging survivors in this process, and of course, paying them when we do that. Being ready to provide really high quality services and support them after we've identified them. That point of identification is not the stopping point. It's right in the middle or off in the beginning. And then another big takeaway for me was that rescue mentality and how harmful that can be. So that does not do this whole conversation justice, but those were just some of my top takeaways from this. Thank you guys so much for sharing your experience. Charlee has put in the chat a link to our satisfaction survey. Please share with us your experience of this event, and visit our website on frameworkta.org, where you can request training and technical assistance. You can apply to be subject matter experts with us, and you can sign up for a newsletter so you'll be the first to know about upcoming events. So thank you everyone for joining us this Friday, and have a great weekend.